Direct question. Would you trust a smile in an old photograph if it meant the difference between silence and survival? Quick context. Hartford, Connecticut, 1906. 12 immigrant girls sewing through the night under gaslight. Dramatic event. Doors locked from the outside, hours stretched to 16, and a foreman who kept 2 keys. Future twist. Decades later, a music box is opened, and what's written on the back of that photo changes everything. Promise. Tonight, you'll see how a lullaby became a message, and why this dramatized story still matters. Before we begin, if stories like this move you, subscribe, like, and turn on notifications so these voices aren't lost again. Comment your city below. It helps us connect real places to the lives behind each image. This photograph was found inside a music box that hadn't been opened in 73 years. When Elizabeth Chen's granddaughter finally broke the lock in 1979, she discovered something that made her hands tremble. The photo showed 12 young women sewing under gaslight. Their faces barely visible in the shadows. But if you look closely at the third girl from the left, you'll notice something that changes everything. She's smiling. Not the exhausted smile of someone trying to survive another 16-hour shift, but the peaceful smile of someone who knows a secret. A secret that would cost her everything she loved, but save 17 lives in the process. And if you stay until the end, you'll discover why this photo was hidden for 7 decades, and why the song these girls sang that night in 1906 still echoes in a small apartment in New York City. This is the story of how a lullaby became a code, and how a 17-year-old girl named Rose McCarthy chose to sing when staying silent would have saved her life. The photograph appeared in a Hartford, Connecticut estate sale in 1979, tucked inside a mahogany music box with a broken mechanism. The auctioneer almost threw it away, but something about those faces stopped him. 12 girls, their fingers frozen mid-stitch, their eyes reflecting the gaslight like small moons in the darkness. But it was the handwriting on the back that made him pause. 7 words, written in faded ink that had bled through the paper over 7 decades. They sang so we could breathe. Rose. And beneath that, a date that shouldn't make sense. March 8th, 1906. 3 days before something happened in that factory that the newspapers never fully reported, and that the factory owners spent thousands of dollars trying to erase from history. But here's what makes this photo impossible to look away from. Every single girl in this picture is holding her needle at the exact same angle. Not the natural variation you'd expect from 12 different people working, but identical. Perfectly synchronized, almost like they'd rehearsed it. And if you know anything about factory work in 1906, you know that synchronization like that wasn't about efficiency. It was about survival. It was about sending a message that management couldn't detect, but that every girl on that floor would understand instantly. A message that meant someone was coming, someone was watching, or someone was about to do something that couldn't be undone. Rose McCarthy was 17 years old when this photo was taken, though her immigration papers said 19 because girls under 18 weren't supposed to work the night shift. She'd been in America for exactly 8 months, arriving from County Cork, Ireland, with her younger sister Catherine and $42 sewn into the hem of her skirt. Their father had died in a farming accident 3 years earlier, and their mother had sold everything, including her wedding ring, to buy them passage on a ship called the Adriatic. The last thing their mother said to Rose was this: "Keep Catherine safe. Keep her singing. As long as she's singing, she's breathing." And Rose had kept that promise every single day for 8 months, teaching her sister lullabies as they sewed through the endless nights at the Pemberton shirtwaist factory, their voices mixing with the voices of 10 other immigrant girls who understood that singing wasn't about joy. It was about staying awake. It was about remembering you were still human. It was about not disappearing into the machinery that consumed girls like them every single day. But Rose was keeping a secret that not even Catherine knew. A secret that would make her choose between her sister's life and 17 others. A secret that started 6 weeks earlier when she noticed something that didn't make sense about the way the foreman, Mr. Edgar Thornton, locked the factory doors every night at exactly 9 o'clock. The rule was simple. Once the night shift started at 6 in the evening, the doors locked from the outside until 6 the next morning. Management said it was to prevent theft, to keep the girls focused, to maintain productivity. But Rose had been watching, and she'd noticed something that made her blood run cold. Mr. Thornton locked the doors with 2 different keys, one for the main entrance on the 1st floor, and one for the emergency exit on the 3rd floor, where the youngest girls worked, where the windows were too high to escape from, where the air was so thick with cotton dust that girls coughed blood into their handkerchiefs and kept sewing because if they stopped, they'd be fired. And if they were fired, they'd starve. And 6 weeks before this photo was taken, Rose had discovered why Mr. Thornton needed 2 keys, because the emergency exit didn't actually open from the inside anymore. Someone had welded it shut from the outside, had painted over the weld marks to hide them, had left those girls on the 3rd floor in a death trap that they didn't even know existed. And when Rose tried to tell the other girls, when she tried to warn them, Mr. Thornton appeared beside her sewing station with a smile that made her understand exactly what would happen if she said another word. "Your sister Catherine works on the 3rd floor, doesn't she, Miss McCarthy? It would be a shame if something happened to her employment or her health. These factories can be so dangerous for careless girls." That was the moment Rose understood. This wasn't about preventing theft. This was about control. This was about making sure that if anything went wrong, if any of these girls tried to organize, tried to demand better conditions, tried to contact the union representatives who'd been circling the factory for months, there would be nowhere to run. They'd be trapped. And Mr. Thornton and the factory owners he worked for would make sure that any girl who caused problems would be made an example of in a way that the other girls would never forget. But what Rose didn't know yet, what she wouldn't discover until the night this photo was taken, was that Mr. Thornton wasn't just locking girls in. He was keeping someone else out, someone who'd been asking questions about the factory's safety violations, about the missing inspection reports, about the 12-year-old girls who worked 18-hour shifts and collapsed at their machines. Someone who was planning to expose everything in a newspaper article that would shut the factory down permanently. And Mr. Thornton had been given orders by the factory owners. Stop the reporter, whatever it takes. And those orders came with a deadline. March 11th, 1906, 3 days after this photo was taken. Rose was standing at her sewing machine on the evening of March 8th, her fingers moving automatically through the familiar motions of attaching sleeves to bodices, when she heard Catherine's voice rise above the other girls in that soft, clear way that always made Rose's heart ache with love and fear. Catherine was singing their mother's lullaby, the one about the blackbird who flew across the ocean to find her lost children. And for just a moment, Rose let herself remember what it felt like to be safe, to be home, to not have to make impossible choices every single day just to survive. That's when she saw him, a man she'd never seen before, standing in the shadows near the loading dock, watching the girls work with an expression that Rose recognized instantly because she'd seen it on the faces of every journalist and reformer who'd ever walked past the factory and then disappeared, silenced by money or threats or both. He was young, maybe 25, with a camera bag slung over his shoulder and a notebook in his hand, and he was staring at the 3rd floor with the kind of focused intensity that meant he'd figured out exactly what Rose had discovered 6 weeks earlier. The emergency exit was a death trap, and he was going to prove it. Hartford, Connecticut, in March of 1906, was a city built on contradictions. The insurance capital of America, where wealthy men wrote policies protecting other wealthy men against fire, flood, and financial ruin, while immigrants worked in factories where fire exits were sealed shut and sprinkler systems were considered unnecessary expenses. The newspapers celebrated Hartford as a beacon of progress and industrial might, while girls like Rose and Catherine worked 16-hour shifts for $3 a week and considered themselves lucky because at least they had jobs. At least they could send money back to Ireland. At least they weren't starving in the streets like so many others who'd made the crossing and found that America's promises were written in ink that disappeared the moment you tried to claim them. The Pemberton Shirtwaist Factory occupied 3 floors of a brick building on Charter Oak Avenue, wedged between a tobacco warehouse and a boarding house where 32 factory girls lived 4 to a room, their rent deducted automatically from their wages before they ever saw the money. The factory owners, the Pemberton brothers, lived in a mansion on Prospect Avenue with 16 rooms, a staff of 8, and a daughter who wore a different shirtwaist every day of the week, each one sewn by girls whose names she'd never know and whose faces she'd never see. That's how Hartford worked in 1906. The people who wore the clothes never met the people who made them. The people who wrote the insurance policies never walked through the factories they were supposed to inspect. And the people who made the rules never had to live with the consequences. Rose had understood this within her first week at Pemberton. The factory operated on a simple system: fear and exhaustion. Keep the girls too tired to think, too scared to organize, too desperate to risk their jobs by complaining. The work was monotonous and dangerous in equal measure. 12 hours on day shift, 16 hours on night shift, 7 days a week with occasional Sundays off if production quotas were met. The machines were old and temperamental, prone to jamming and catching fire. Maintained by a drunk mechanic who showed up twice a week and mostly just oiled the parts that made the most noise. The gas lights flickered constantly, casting shadows that made it impossible to see clearly, which meant injuries were common. Needles through fingers, scissors through palms, burns from the pressing irons that the girls had to heat themselves on coal stoves that filled the air with smoke that mixed with the cotton dust until breathing felt like drowning. But the worst part wasn't the work or the conditions. It was the knowledge that none of it had to be this way. That the factory owners had money for lawyers and political connections and newspaper advertisements, but not for fire escapes or ventilation or adequate lighting. That every girl in that factory knew someone who'd been injured or killed in a factory accident, and that those accidents were always ruled as worker negligence, never management failure. That survival wasn't about working hard or being careful, it was about being lucky. And luck, Rose had learned, was a currency that immigrant girls couldn't afford. She'd grown up in County Cork in a stone cottage with a thatched roof that leaked when it rained, and a fireplace that barely kept them warm through the Irish winters. Her father had been a tenant farmer, working land that belonged to an English landlord who lived in London and collected rent through an agent who rode through the countryside once a month with a ledger and a pistol. When Rose was 14, her father had tried to negotiate a reduction in rent after 3 years of bad harvests, and the agent had responded by raising the rent instead. 6 months later, her father was dead, crushed beneath his own plow when his horse spooked during a thunderstorm, and Rose had found him in the mud with his eyes still open and his hands still gripping the reins like he was trying to hold on to something that had already slipped away. Her mother had sold everything to send Rose and Catherine to America because she believed the lie that everyone believed, that America was different, that America was opportunity, that if you worked hard enough, if you sacrificed enough, if you just held on long enough, you'd find something better than what you left behind. And for 8 months, Rose had been trying to make that lie true. She'd been trying to believe that the 16-hour shifts and the $3 wages and the locked doors were temporary, that they'd save enough money to bring their mother over, that they'd find a way out of the factory and into something resembling the life they'd been promised. But the night she discovered the welded emergency exit, Rose stopped believing in American promises because she realized that the system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as designed. The factories needed desperate workers who wouldn't complain. The owners needed politicians who wouldn't regulate. The newspapers needed advertising revenue from the factories. And everyone needed immigrants to keep coming, keep working, keep dying quietly so the whole machinery of American industry could keep grinding forward without interruption. That's what made the man with the camera so dangerous. He was disrupting the machinery. He was asking questions that weren't supposed to be asked and taking photographs that weren't supposed to exist. And Rose knew, with the certainty of someone who'd watched her father die for trying to negotiate with power, that men like him didn't survive in cities like Hartford. They got bought off or scared off or disappeared into the same shadows that swallowed up every other person who'd ever tried to fight back against the people who owned everything. His name was Thomas Ashford, though Rose wouldn't learn that until later, until after everything had already happened and it was too late to change any of it. He was 26 years old, a reporter for the Hartford Courant, who'd been assigned to write a series on factory conditions after a 12-year-old girl named Anna Kowalski had collapsed at her sewing machine and died before anyone realized what was happening. Her body discovered hours later because the other girls were too afraid to stop working and check on her. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, but Thomas had talked to the girls who worked beside her, had heard them describe how she'd been coughing blood for weeks, how she'd asked for water and been told to get back to work, how she'd finally just slumped forward onto her machine and stopped breathing while the girl next to her kept sewing because that's what you did if you wanted to survive. Thomas had been writing about factory conditions for 3 months, building a case that he planned to publish in a 6-part series starting March 12th, 1906. He had documentation of safety violations, testimonies from injured workers, photographs of dangerous conditions, and evidence that factory inspectors were being bribed to ignore violations. But he needed one more piece of evidence: proof that the factory owners knew about the dangers and chose profit over safety anyway. And that's what had brought him to Pemberton on March 8th, just after nightfall, with his camera and his notebook, and a contact inside the factory who'd promised to show him something that would make his case undeniable. That contact was Rose McCarthy, though she didn't know it yet. Rose had been recruited 2 days earlier by a woman named Margaret O'Sullivan, a former factory worker who now worked with a coalition of union organizers and reformers trying to improve conditions for immigrant workers. Margaret had approached Rose outside the boarding house, had spoken to her in Gaelic so no one else could understand, had told her that there was a reporter who wanted to expose the Pemberton brothers, and that all Rose had to do was let him into the factory during the night shift and show him the welded emergency exit. "One photograph," Margaret had said. "That's all we need. One photograph that proves they're trapping girls in fire traps, and we can shut them down. We can save every girl in that factory." And Rose had said yes, because she was 17 years old and still stupid enough to believe that justice was possible, because she thought about Anna Kowalski dying at her machine, and about Catherine working on the 3rd floor with no way out if something went wrong, because she was tired of being afraid, and tired of being powerless, and tired of watching girls disappear into the machinery of American industry, like they'd never existed at all. What Rose didn't know was that Mr. Thornton had been watching her for weeks, that he'd seen her checking the emergency exit, asking questions, talking to Margaret O'Sullivan, that he'd reported her to the Pemberton brothers, who'd given him authorization to handle the situation in whatever way he deemed necessary, and that on the night of March 8th, 1906, Mr. Thornton had moved Catherine from her usual station on the 3rd floor to a new position directly beside his office on the 2nd floor, where he could watch her every moment, where she was isolated from the other girls, where she wouldn't be able to call for help if something happened. It was a message, and Rose understood it perfectly. If she helped the reporter, Catherine would pay the price. Rose was standing at her sewing machine at 8:45 that evening when Thomas Ashford appeared in the doorway of the loading dock, exactly as planned. She'd left the door unlocked as Margaret had instructed, had positioned herself where she could see him enter, had prepared herself for what she needed to do. Show him the emergency exit, let him take his photograph. Get him out of the factory before anyone noticed. Simple. Quick. Over in 15 minutes. But then she looked across the factory floor and saw Mr. Thornton standing beside Catherine's machine, his hand resting on her shoulder in a gesture that looked almost paternal, but made Rose's stomach twist with terror. And she understood that nothing about this was going to be simple. That Mr. Thornton was forcing her to choose. Help the reporter and watch Catherine disappear into whatever punishment the Pemberton brothers had planned. Or stay silent and let 17 girls keep working in a death trap that would eventually kill them all. That's when Rose did something that no one expected. Not Thomas Ashford, not Margaret O'Sullivan, not Mr. Thornton. She started singing. The same lullaby her mother had taught her, the one about the blackbird who flew across the ocean to find her lost children. And one by one, the other girls joined in, their voices rising through the factory like a tide, until all 12 girls on the floor were singing in perfect harmony, their needles moving in perfect synchronization, their eyes fixed on their work, but their attention focused on something that management couldn't see and couldn't stop. It was the signal. The code that the girls had developed over months of working together, suffering together, surviving together. A warning system built into music that sounded like nothing more than exhausted workers trying to stay awake. But Rose had just changed the melody in a way that every girl on that floor would understand instantly. Danger, visitor, hold position. And most importantly, trust me. Because Rose had just figured out how to save her sister, help the reporter, and expose the Pemberton brothers all at the same time. But it required doing something that terrified her more than anything she'd ever done in her 17 years of life. It required trusting that the other girls would understand what she was about to do. And it required making Mr. Thornton believe that she'd chosen Catherine over everyone else, right up until the moment when it was too late for him to stop what was coming. The song Rose chose was called The Blackbird's Promise, and every Irish girl in that factory knew it by heart. It was a lullaby that mothers sang to children who were hungry, a promise that even when everything was lost, even when the ocean separated families and poverty consumed hope, love would find a way to bring lost children home. But the version Rose was singing now had subtle changes that transformed it from a lullaby into a coded message that only the girls who'd worked beside her for 8 months would recognize. She slowed the tempo by exactly 3 beats per minute, which meant danger. She emphasized the third word of every line, which meant watch the doors. And she added a harmony on the chorus that only Catherine knew, which meant, little sister, I need you to trust me, even if you don't understand what's happening. Thomas Ashford stood frozen in the loading dock entrance, his camera bag suddenly feeling impossibly heavy, watching this scene unfold with the growing realization that he'd walked into something far more complex than a simple photograph of a safety violation. The girls were communicating right in front of management, right under Mr. Thornton's nose, using a language that the factory owners had never bothered to learn, because they'd never bothered to see these girls as anything more than interchangeable parts in their industrial machine. And the girl who'd let him in, the Irish girl with dark hair and fierce eyes, who Margaret had told him to trust, was orchestrating something that he didn't fully understand but instinctively knew was either brilliant or suicidal or both. Rose kept singing, her fingers never stopping their mechanical dance through fabric and thread, her eyes never leaving her work, but her awareness extended through the entire factory floor, like she was conducting an invisible orchestra. She could feel Mr. Thornton's attention shift from Catherine to her, could sense his confusion as he tried to understand what had changed, why the atmosphere had suddenly become charged with something he couldn't identify. She could see Thomas Ashford in her peripheral vision, could sense his uncertainty about whether to proceed or retreat. And most importantly, she could hear the other girls picking up the coded harmonies, spreading the message through the factory like a ripple through water, preparing for something that Rose hadn't even fully explained because there hadn't been time. Because this plan had formed in her mind only 60 seconds ago. Because sometimes survival meant trusting your instincts and hoping that the people you'd bled beside would understand what you needed without being told. The plan was insane. It violated every rule of factory employment and probably several laws. It would either save 17 lives or destroy them all. And it depended entirely on Mr. Thornton making a predictable choice in the next 90 seconds. Rose shifted her song again, adding a verse that wasn't part of the original lullaby, a verse about a door that appeared locked but could be opened from the inside if you knew where to push. And as she sang, her eyes finally lifted from her work and met Catherine's across the factory floor. Her little sister, 15 years old though her papers said 17, with their mother's gentle face and their father's stubborn determination, looked back at her with confusion and fear and absolute trust. Whatever Rose was planning, Catherine would follow. That's what sisters did. That's what survival required. Mr. Thornton's patience broke exactly as Rose had calculated. He was a man who controlled through intimidation and violence, and watching 12 immigrant girls communicate in code right in front of him, while a stranger stood in the loading dock entrance, made him feel something he couldn't tolerate. Loss of control. He grabbed Catherine's arm and hauled her up from her sewing machine, his grip tight enough to leave bruises, his voice loud enough to carry through the entire factory. "Miss McCarthy, your sister seems to have forgotten the rules about unauthorized visitors. Perhaps you'd like to accompany me to the office while we discuss the consequences of such carelessness." It was exactly what Rose had been counting on. Mr. Thornton taking Catherine as leverage. Mr. Thornton moving away from the factory floor. Mr. Thornton creating a distraction that would let Rose do what needed to be done. She stopped singing mid-verse, letting the abrupt silence shock through the other girls like a physical blow, then called out in a voice that shook with perfectly calculated fear. "Please, Mr. Thornton, I'll send him away. Just don't hurt my sister. I'll do whatever you want." Thomas Ashford started to move, started to step forward because even if he was a reporter trying to remain objective, he was still a human being watching a 15-year-old girl being threatened by a man twice her size. But Rose caught his eye and shook her head once, a tiny gesture that somehow communicated everything she needed him to understand. Stay, watch, bear witness. This is part of the plan. Mr. Thornton smiled, the expression of a predator who just confirmed his dominance, and started walking toward his office with Catherine in tow. The other girls had stopped working, their hands frozen over their machines, their faces showing various degrees of fear and confusion and that particular exhaustion that comes from watching injustice happen over and over and being powerless to stop it. But Rose noticed something that Mr. Thornton didn't. 3 of the girls, the ones closest to the emergency exit on the 3rd floor stairwell, had shifted their positions slightly, angling their bodies toward the stairs, their attention focused on Rose like they were waiting for a signal that would tell them what to do next. Rose stood up from her sewing machine, her legs shaking not from fear but from adrenaline, from the knowledge that the next 3 minutes would determine whether she just condemned her sister or saved 17 lives. She walked toward Mr. Thornton's office, passing within inches of Thomas Ashford. And as she passed, she whispered 4 words in a voice so quiet that only he could hear. 3rd floor, emergency exit. Then she raised her voice to carry through the entire factory, projecting the kind of desperate pleading that management expected from girls like her. "Mr. Thornton, please, I'm begging you. My sister didn't know about the visitor. This is all my fault. Punish me, not her. I'll work double shifts. I'll accept any wage reduction. Just please don't fire her. We need this job. We'll starve without it." It was a performance, every word calculated, every gesture designed to reinforce Mr. Thornton's sense of power and control. And while Rose was performing her desperate plea, while Mr. Thornton was savoring his victory, while Catherine was trying to understand what was happening, Rose was counting seconds in her head. 30 seconds for Thomas to reach the 3rd floor. 45 seconds for him to photograph the welded emergency exit. 60 seconds for him to document the locked windows. 90 seconds for him to capture evidence that would destroy the Pemberton brothers and everything they'd built on the backs of girls who had no power and no voice and no choice but to keep working or die trying. Mr. Thornton dragged Catherine into his office and shoved her into a chair, his attention fully focused on demonstrating his authority, his control, his absolute power over these immigrant girls who dared to challenge the system he'd been hired to maintain. He didn't notice that Rose had stopped just outside his door instead of following them inside. He didn't notice that the other girls had started singing again, a different song this time, one that sounded like a hymn, but was actually a countdown. He didn't notice that the gaslight in his office was flickering more than usual, that the shadows were deeper than they should be, that something was wrong with the entire atmosphere of the factory. What Mr. S. Thornton didn't understand, what the Pemberton brothers didn't understand, what no one who'd ever profited from immigrant labor understood, was that girls like Rose and Catherine and the 10 others who worked through these endless nights weren't just surviving. They were watching. They were learning. They were building networks of resistance that management couldn't see, because management had never bothered to look at them as human beings capable of strategy and coordination and collective action. Thomas Ashford reached the 3rd floor and immediately understood why Rose had sent him there. The emergency exit was obviously welded shut, the weld marks visible even under the poor lighting, the door handle still attached but completely non-functional. But worse than that, the windows along the far wall had been nailed shut from the outside, the nails painted over to hide them, creating a sealed box that would become a death trap the moment anything went wrong. He started photographing everything, his hands steady despite the adrenaline pumping through his system, his journalistic training taking over, as he documented angles and details and evidence that would be undeniable in any court of law. But then he heard it. A sound that made his blood freeze. Shouting from downstairs. A woman's scream. The crash of something heavy hitting the floor. And beneath it all, that eerie singing that the girls maintained like a heartbeat, like a prayer, like a promise that they'd see this through no matter what it cost them. Rose had started phase 2 of her insane plan. She'd grabbed the gaslight fixture in Mr. Thornton's office and yanked it hard enough to crack the fitting, causing gas to start leaking into the small space, the smell immediately recognizable and terrifying to anyone who'd worked around industrial gas systems. Then she'd screamed loud enough to alert the entire factory, had grabbed Catherine's hand and pulled her out of the office, had yelled the one word that would create instant chaos and force Mr. Thornton to react exactly as she needed him to react. Fire. There was no fire. Not yet. But the smell of leaking gas and the panic in Rose's voice was enough to trigger the one thing that terrified factory workers more than anything else in 1906. The memory of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire that would happen 5 years later was still in the future. But fires in textile factories were common enough that every girl in that building knew exactly what happened when fire met cotton dust and gaslight and locked exits. They died. Trapped and burning and screaming for help that never came, because the doors were locked and the emergency exits didn't work, and the factory owners cared more about preventing theft than preventing death. The girls on the 1st and 2nd floors started moving immediately, their survival instincts overriding their fear of management, their collective memory of every factory fire they'd ever heard about, driving them toward the main entrance that was locked from the outside. They pounded on the doors, screaming for someone to open them, creating enough noise and chaos that Mr. Thornton had to make a choice. Deal with Rose and Catherine, or deal with the riot that was forming at the locked entrance. He chose the entrance because he was a man who controlled through authority and the illusion of safety, and watching that illusion crumble in front of him was more than his ego could tolerate. The moment Mr. Thornton headed for the main entrance, Rose turned to Catherine and gripped her shoulders hard enough to make her little sister focus, despite the chaos erupting around them. Listen to me. Run to the third floor right now. There's a reporter up there named Thomas. He's going to take a photograph of you standing next to the welded emergency exit. Do you understand? Stand next to it. Look scared. Let him photograph you. This is how we save everyone." Catherine stared at her sister for exactly 2 seconds. Her 15-year-old mind processing impossible information at impossible speed, then nodded once and ran. Not because she fully understood, but because Rose had kept her alive for 8 months in a country that wanted to consume them both. And if Rose said this was how they survived, then Catherine would trust her with the same absolute faith she'd trusted their mother when she'd put them on a ship to America and promised that everything would be better on the other side of the ocean. Thomas Ashford was preparing to leave the third floor, his photographs taken and his evidence secured, when a teenage girl burst through the stairwell door and ran straight to him, her face showing a combination of terror and determination that he'd remember for the rest of his life. "I'm Catherine McCarthy," she gasped, Rose's sister. "She said you need a photograph of someone at this exit. Someone whose face shows what it means to work in a trap." Thomas had worked as a reporter for 4 years. He'd covered murders and political corruption and industrial accidents. But he'd never met anyone like these McCarthy sisters, who somehow managed to turn their own oppression into a weapon against the people who'd built their fortune on suffering. He raised his camera without hesitation, adjusting for the poor light, framing Catherine against the welded emergency exit with the nailed windows visible in the background, capturing an image that would appear in the Hartford Courant 5 days later and spark an investigation that would eventually shut down 3 factories and lead to new safety regulations that would save hundreds of lives. But at that moment, Thomas and Catherine didn't know any of that. All they knew was that downstairs, Rose was playing a dangerous game with a violent man, and that somewhere in the next 60 seconds, this entire situation would either resolve into something survivable or explode into tragedy that would echo through decades. Mr. Thornton reached the main entrance and realized with growing fury that there was no fire. The smell of gas was real, coming from his damaged office fixture, but there was no flame, no smoke, no actual danger. Just panic. Just chaos. Just 12 immigrant girls who'd somehow managed to create a distraction that had pulled him away from his authority and his control. And when he turned around and saw Rose standing in the middle of the factory floor, her face showing something that looked less like fear and more like triumph, he understood that he'd been played, that this 17-year-old Irish girl had somehow outmaneuvered him, that whatever was happening right now was part of a plan that he hadn't seen coming, because he'd made the fatal mistake of underestimating the intelligence and coordination of workers he'd dismissed as powerless. That's when the photographer appeared at the top of the third-floor stairs with Catherine beside him, his camera visible and his evidence secured. And Mr. Thornton understood with perfect clarity that his career, his authority, and possibly his freedom had just been destroyed by a teenage girl who'd learned something that he'd never understood. That power isn't always about control. Sometimes it's about sacrifice. Sometimes it's about knowing what you're willing to lose in order to save the people you love. Sometimes it's about singing lullabies that hide revolutions. The factory floor at 9:23 on the evening of March 8, 1906, was frozen in a tableau that would later be described in Thomas Ashford's newspaper article as a moment when the machinery of industrial oppression stopped long enough for truth to slip through its gears. 12 young women stood motionless at their sewing machines, having abandoned the pretense of work the moment Catherine appeared on the third-floor landing. Mr. Thornton stood near the locked main entrance, his face cycling through expressions of rage and calculation, as he tried to determine how to salvage a situation that had spiraled completely beyond his control. Thomas Ashford descended the stairs slowly, his camera bag held protectively against his chest, his reporter's instinct telling him that the most dangerous moments in any confrontation come not at the beginning, but at the end. when powerful men realize they've lost and decide whether to accept defeat or burn everything down rather than surrender. And Rose McCarthy stood in the center of it all, 17 years old and terrified and exhilarated, because she'd just done something that girls like her weren't supposed to be capable of doing. She'd fought back. She'd won. She'd turned the system's own machinery against itself and created evidence that couldn't be hidden or bought off or dismissed as the complaints of ungrateful immigrants who didn't understand how good they had it in America. But Rose also understood something that made her celebration short-lived. Winning this battle didn't mean surviving the war. Mr. Thornton still controlled the keys to the factory. The Pemberton brothers still owned the building and had connections to every politician and judge in Hartford. And Thomas Ashford, for all his good intentions, was still just one reporter working for a newspaper that depended on advertising revenue from the same factory owners he was trying to expose. This moment of triumph could disappear as quickly as it had appeared, erased from history like so many other moments when workers had dared to challenge power and been crushed for their audacity. Mr. Thornton's voice, when he finally spoke, was cold enough to make the air feel 10 degrees colder. "Mr. Ashford, I assume? I'm Edgar Thornton, floor manager for the Pemberton Shirtwaist Factory. I'm afraid you're trespassing on private property. Whatever photographs you believe you've taken will need to be surrendered immediately, along with any notes you've compiled. And these girls," he gestured to Rose and Catherine, "will be terminated effective immediately for violating factory security protocols and endangering their fellow workers with false fire alarms." Thomas had prepared for this moment. He'd consulted with lawyers before beginning his investigation, had understood exactly what rights he had and didn't have when documenting conditions on private property. His voice was steady and professional, carrying the authority of someone who knew the law well enough to use it as a shield. "Mr. Thornton, I'm working on assignment for the Hartford Courant, documenting workplace conditions as part of a series on industrial safety. I entered this factory through an unlocked loading dock entrance, which constitutes implied permission under Connecticut trespass law. The photographs I've taken document safety violations that fall under public interest exemptions to privacy rights. And these young women," he nodded toward Rose and Catherine, "have provided testimony as witnesses to conditions that may violate state labor laws and municipal fire codes. I'd be happy to discuss this further with your employers and their legal counsel, but the photographs and testimony will be published as scheduled on March 12th. The silence that followed Thomas's statement lasted exactly 7 seconds, but those 7 seconds contained entire lifetimes of tension. Rose watched Mr. Thornton's face and saw the exact moment when he made his choice. Not acceptance, not surrender, but calculation. He was a man who'd spent 20 years enforcing the will of factory owners against workers who had no power. And he'd learned that the law was flexible when you had money and connections, that evidence could disappear, that witnesses could be intimidated into silence or discredited as unreliable foreigners who barely spoke English and didn't understand American customs. Mr. Thornton's hand moved toward his pocket, and for one heart-stopping moment Rose thought he was reaching for a weapon. But instead he pulled out a small leather notebook and began writing, his pen scratching across the paper with deliberate precision. "Miss Rose McCarthy, hired August 3, 1905, terminated March 8, 1906, for gross misconduct including trespassing facilitation, false fire alarm creation, and incitement of worker disruption. Miss Catherine McCarthy, hired August 3, 1905, terminated March 8, 1906, for conspiracy to violate factory security protocols. Both girls to be reported to the Hartford Police Department for criminal trespass and malicious mischief. Both girls to be blacklisted from employment at any textile facility in Hartford County." He looked up from his notebook and smiled, and that smile contained more cruelty than any physical violence could have conveyed. "Mr. Ashford, you may publish whatever you like. The Pemberton brothers have excellent legal representation and relationships with your newspaper's ownership that predate your employment. But these girls, they'll never work in this city again. they'll be evicted from their boarding house by Monday morning. And within a week, they'll be starving in the streets or on a ship back to whatever miserable country they came from, which I believe is precisely what they deserve for showing such ingratitude for the opportunities America has provided them. It was Catherine who broke first, not with tears, but with something that surprised everyone in the factory, including Rose. She laughed. Not the hysterical laughter of someone losing control, but the clear, genuine laughter of someone who just understood a joke that no one else had caught yet. Every face turned toward her. This 15-year-old girl who should have been terrified but instead looked almost joyful. And when she spoke, her voice carried through the factory with perfect clarity. "Mr. Thornton, you're absolutely right. We probably will lose our jobs and our housing. We might even end up back in Ireland, though I suspect we'll find work somewhere else in America because there's always another factory willing to hire desperate girls. But here's what you haven't considered. You just admitted, in front of 12 witnesses and a newspaper reporter, that you intend to blacklist us for exposing safety violations. That's retaliation. That's illegal under the Connecticut Labor Act of 1903. And unlike the safety violations, which might take weeks to investigate and prosecute, retaliation against whistleblowers is criminal offense that can result in immediate arrest and prosecution." The silence that followed Catherine's statement was different from the earlier tension. This was the silence of people realizing that they'd underestimated someone badly, that assumptions about education and intelligence had led them to dismiss a threat that was now impossible to ignore. Rose stared at her little sister with a mixture of shock and pride. Because in 8 months of working beside Catherine, she'd never once heard her speak with that kind of authority and knowledge. Where had she learned about labor laws? How did she know about retaliation protections? Catherine caught Rose's expression and smiled. The same gentle smile their mother used to give them when she taught them something important disguised as a simple story or song. "Margaret O'Sullivan didn't just ask you to help the reporter, Rose. She's been teaching me labor law every Sunday for the past 3 months, preparing me to testify if this moment ever came. You're not the only McCarthy sister who can keep secrets." The revelation hit Rose like a physical blow, not from hurt, but from understanding. The plan had never been about just getting Thomas into the factory for a photograph. It had been about creating a moment so public, so well documented, with so many witnesses, that the Pemberton brothers and men like Mr. Thornton couldn't make it disappear. Margaret O'Sullivan and the union organizers she worked with had been building toward this confrontation for months, using Rose and Catherine and the other girls as pieces in a strategy that none of them had fully understood, because understanding the whole plan would have made them too nervous to play their parts naturally. Thomas Ashford was already writing in his notebook, his journalist's instincts recognizing that this story had just become much bigger than factory safety violations. "Mr. Thornton, for the record, are you confirming that you intend to blacklist these workers specifically for cooperating with a news investigation into safety violations? And are you stating that intention in front of multiple witnesses?" Mr. Thornton's face went through several shades of red as he realized the trap he'd walked into. Admitting retaliation was criminal. Denying it now would contradict what 12 girls and a reporter had just heard him say. And attempting to intimidate witnesses after making such an admission would only compound his legal problems. He'd been so focused on maintaining his authority, on demonstrating his power over these girls who dared to challenge him, that he'd forgotten the first rule of institutional oppression. Never admit the cruelty out loud. Never make the violence explicit. Always maintain plausible deniability. But it was too late for that now. The truth was out. The evidence was documented, and the machinery that had protected men like Mr. Thornton for decades was beginning to crack under the weight of its own contradictions. Rose stepped forward, and when she spoke, her voice wasn't the desperate pleading she'd performed earlier. It was calm and steady and filled with the kind of quiet strength that comes from knowing you've already lost everything you were afraid of losing. Which means you have nothing left to fear. "Mr. Thornton, you're right that we'll probably lose our jobs. You're right that we might end up hungry or homeless or sent back to Ireland. But you're wrong about one thing. We're not ungrateful for the opportunities America has given us. We're angry about the lies America told us. We were promised opportunity and given exploitation. We were promised safety and given death traps. We were promised that if we worked hard enough, we could build something better. But the only thing we've built is profit for men who see us as machinery that occasionally breaks down and needs replacing." She turned to face the other 10 girls who'd been silent witnesses to everything that had happened. Girls whose names would appear in Thomas Ashford's article, and whose testimonies would eventually contribute to labor reforms that would protect thousands of workers. "You all know what he's going to do next. He's going to try to buy some of us off, threaten others, turn us against each other. He's going to tell us that if we recant our testimony, we can keep our jobs. He's going to promise things he has no intention of delivering. And some of you might take those offers because you're desperate and tired and you need to survive. I understand that. No one here will judge you for it." Rose paused, making eye contact with each girl in turn, seeing in their faces the same exhaustion and fear and determination that she felt in her own chest. "But here's what I need you to know. Whether we win or lose this particular fight, whether the Pemberton brothers get shut down or find a way to escape consequences, we've already changed something that can't be unchanged. We've proven that girls like us can fight back. We've shown that the system isn't invincible. We've created evidence that will exist even if we don't. And someday, maybe not next week or next year, but someday, other girls will hear about what we did tonight. And they'll know that resistance is possible, that sacrifice can mean something, that even when you have no power, you still have choices." The moment stretched out, heavy with significance that none of them could fully process yet because they were too deep inside it to see its shape. But years later, when some of those girls were grandmothers telling stories to children who'd grown up with labor protections and fire codes and the assumption that workers had rights, they would remember this moment as the night when something shifted. When the machinery of oppression paused long enough for humanity to slip through its gears. Mr. Thornton's response was interrupted by the sound of police whistles outside the factory. Margaret O'Sullivan, it turned out, had been waiting across the street with 2 police officers who were sympathetic to labor causes, ready to intervene the moment the confrontation inside became dangerous or illegal. She'd planned for every contingency, had understood exactly how men like Mr. Thornton would react when their authority was challenged, and had positioned her forces accordingly. The police entered through the loading dock entrance that Rose had left unlocked, their uniforms and authority immediately changing the dynamics of the confrontation. The senior officer, a man named Patrick Donnelly, whose own sister had died in a factory accident 8 years earlier, looked at the scene with eyes that had seen too many versions of this same story. Young women trapped in dangerous conditions, management more concerned with profit than safety. Evidence that would probably be suppressed by people with more money and connections than a beat cop could fight against. But Officer Donnelly also saw Thomas Ashford with his camera and notebook, and he understood that this time might be different. This time there was documentation. This time there were witnesses who hadn't been scared into silence yet. This time there might actually be consequences for people who'd operated with impunity for too long. He pulled out his own notebook and began taking statements, starting with Mr. Thornton's admission of intent to blacklist workers, moving through Thomas's testimony about the safety violations, and ending with brief statements from each of the 12 girls about the conditions they'd worked under. The entire process took 47 minutes. 47 minutes during which Rose and Catherine stood together, hands clasped, watching justice move at the slow pace of bureaucracy and law, knowing that this was just the beginning of a much longer fight. 47 minutes during which the other girls gave testimony that was brave and terrifying, and would probably cost them more than they could afford to lose. 47 minutes during which Mr. Thornton stood silent and furious, already calculating how the Pemberton brothers would respond, already planning his defense, already preparing to make these girls pay for their defiance in ways that the law couldn't prevent or punish. And it was during those 47 minutes, while Officer Donnelly was interviewing the third girl, and Thomas Ashford was reviewing his photographs, and Mr. Thornton was staring at Rose with naked hatred, that something happened that no one had planned for. A photographer arrived. Not Thomas Ashford with his professional equipment and newspaper credentials, but a street photographer named Jacob Weiss who'd heard the police whistles and thought there might be something worth documenting. He was one of hundreds of immigrant photographers who worked the streets of Hartford, taking portraits and street scenes and selling them for pennies to people who wanted physical memories of their American lives. Jacob walked into the factory with his camera and his flash powder, took in the scene of 12 young women standing at their sewing machines with police officers and a reporter and an angry floor manager, and understood immediately that he was witnessing something significant. He didn't ask permission. He just raised his camera, arranged his flash powder, and called out, "Ladies, please look at the camera and continue your work as you normally would." Us? The girls looked at each other, uncertain and exhausted, and still processing everything that had happened in the past hour. And then Rose started singing. The same lullaby she'd been singing all night. The Blackbird's Promise. But this time without any coded messages or hidden meanings. Just a simple song about love and sacrifice and keeping promises even when everything else is falling apart. One by one, the other girls joined in, their voices blending into harmony that was heartbreaking and beautiful, their hands moving through the familiar motions of their work, their faces showing exhaustion and determination, and something that might have been hope, or might have just been the stubborn refusal to surrender. Jacob Weiss captured that moment. 12 girls sewing under gaslight, their needles caught mid-stitch, their voices frozen in song, their faces reflecting a story that would take decades to fully understand. He captured Rose in the center, her expression showing the weight of choices that 17-year-olds shouldn't have to make. He captured Catherine beside her, looking at her sister with absolute trust and love. He captured the other 10 girls, each one with her own story of sacrifice and survival, and the terrible mathematics of poverty that made factory work seem like opportunity instead of exploitation. The photograph that Jacob Weiss took that night wasn't part of Thomas Ashford's planned investigation. It wasn't intended as evidence or documentation. It was just a moment, captured because a street photographer thought it might be worth selling to someone someday. He sold it to Rose McCarthy 3 days later for 15 cents, which was money she couldn't afford but spent anyway because she understood that someday, when she was old and the memories were fading, she'd want proof that this moment had actually happened, that she and Catherine and 10 other girls had fought back and won something, even if that something was just the right to say they'd tried. The Hartford Courant published Thomas Ashford's expose on March 12, 1906, as planned, but with significant modifications from his original draft. The Pemberton brothers did indeed have relationships with the newspaper's ownership, and those relationships resulted in editorial changes that softened the language, removed some of the most damning accusations, and buried the story on page 7 instead of the front page where it belonged. But even a diluted version of the truth was more than the Pemberton brothers could survive. The photograph of Catherine standing beside the welded emergency exit appeared alongside Thomas's article, and within 48 hours, state labor inspectors were demanding access to the factory for emergency safety evaluations. The inspections took 3 weeks and revealed violations far worse than anyone had suspected. The welded emergency exit on the 3rd floor was just the beginning. The building itself was structurally unsound, with support beams that had been damaged by water and never repaired. The fire suppression system was non-existent. The ventilation was so poor that cotton dust had accumulated to levels that made the entire factory a potential explosion hazard. And the employment records showed dozens of workers under the age of 14, working hours that violated every child labor law on the books. The Pemberton Shirtwaist Factory was shut down permanently on April 3, 1906. The Pemberton brothers were fined $12,000 and banned from operating manufacturing facilities in Connecticut, though they simply moved their operations to Massachusetts under a different company name and continued exploiting workers with slightly more care to hide the evidence. Mr. Edgar Thornton was arrested for retaliation against whistleblowers and served 4 months in county jail before being released and finding work as a floor manager at another factory in Providence, Rhode Island, where he continued his career of casual cruelty with more discretion and less visible violence. And the 12 girls whose testimony had made the closure possible? They were blacklisted from factory work in Hartford exactly as Mr. Thornton had promised. Most of them found employment in other cities, other factories, other versions of the same exploitation they'd escaped. 3 of them went back to their home countries, defeated by an America that had promised opportunity and delivered only exhaustion. 2 of them got married and left the workforce entirely, trading factory oppression for domestic oppression because those were often the only choices available to immigrant women in 1906. But Rose and Catherine McCarthy's story took a different turn, though not the triumphant trajectory that newspaper stories and Hollywood movies would later pretend characterized every immigrant success story. They were evicted from their boarding house on March 10, 1906, 2 days after the confrontation at the factory. They spent 3 weeks living in a shelter run by Catholic Charities, where they slept on cots in a room with 30 other homeless women and ate thin soup and stale bread, while searching desperately for any kind of employment that would let them survive. Catherine found work first, hired by a different shirtwaist factory in New Haven that hadn't heard about the blacklist or didn't care. But the conditions were barely better than Pemberton, the hours just as brutal, the pay just as inadequate. Rose struggled for 2 months before finally finding employment as a housemaid for a wealthy family in Hartford's Asylum Hill neighborhood, where she worked 16-hour days cleaning and cooking and caring for children who weren't hers, earning slightly more than she'd made at the factory, but losing the solidarity and community that had made factory work bearable. They sent money back to their mother in Ireland every month, faithful to the promise they'd made when they left County Cork. They wrote letters describing America as a land of opportunity where hard work was rewarded, because telling the truth would have broken their mother's heart and made their sacrifices seem pointless. They survived, which is what immigrants did when the American dream failed to materialize. They survived and hoped that their children would have something better, that sacrifice might accumulate across generations until finally someone in their family line would achieve the prosperity and security that had been promised to them. But something else happened in the years following the Pemberton closure, something that Rose and Catherine couldn't have predicted. The photograph that Jacob Weiss had taken, the image of 12 girls sewing and singing under gaslight, began circulating through labor organizing networks. Margaret O'Sullivan used it in presentations about worker resistance. Union organizers displayed it at rallies and meetings. Journalists referenced it in articles about the need for labor reforms, and slowly, imperceptibly, the image became something more than documentation. It became a symbol. A reminder that workers had power when they acted collectively. That young immigrant women were capable of courage and strategy and resistance. Thomas Ashford continued his reporting on labor conditions and eventually became one of the most respected investigative journalists in New England, though he never forgot that his career was built on the bravery of girls who'd risked everything, while he risked only his reputation. He stayed in contact with Rose for 17 years, until his death from influenza in 1923, and his letters to her were filled with updates about labor reforms that had been influenced by the Pemberton investigation. New fire codes in Connecticut, mandatory safety inspections, restrictions on child labor, protections for whistleblowers. Small victories that accumulated slowly, like interest on a debt that America owed to workers who'd built its prosperity, while receiving almost nothing in return. Rose worked as a housemaid for 6 years before saving enough money to rent a small apartment and start taking in sewing work independently. She never worked in a factory again, could never tolerate the smell of machine oil and cotton dust without feeling that old familiar panic rising in her chest. But she built a modest business repairing and altering clothes for Hartford's middle class, earning just enough to survive and save small amounts toward a future that always seemed just slightly out of reach. Catherine left factory work in 1910 after a fire at her New Haven factory killed 3 girls and injured 17 others. She moved back to Hartford and worked alongside Rose in the sewing business, and together they created something that resembled stability, if not quite prosperity. They brought their mother over from Ireland in 1912, pooling 8 years of savings to pay for her passage, and creating a household that was cramped and difficult, but genuine, in a way that their early months in America had never been. It was their mother, Margaret McCarthy Sr., who discovered something about the photograph that her daughters hadn't fully understood. She'd been living with them for 3 months when Rose showed her the picture that Jacob Weiss had taken that night at Pemberton, explaining the circumstances and the confrontation and the small victories that had followed. Their mother studied the photograph for a long time, her fingers tracing the faces of her daughters and the other girls, and then she said something that Rose would remember for the rest of her life. "You're singing my lullaby in this picture, aren't you? The Blackbird's Promise. I can tell from the way your mouths are shaped, from the expression on Catherine's face. You were singing the song I taught you about never abandoning your children, no matter how far you fly or how lost you become." Rose confirmed it, and her mother smiled with sadness and pride in equal measure. "Then this photograph isn't about factory work or labor violations or any of those important things the newspapers wrote about. This photograph is about keeping promises, about sisters who protect each other, about girls who sing lullabies in the darkness, because that's how you remember you're still human. That's the real story, Mochweisel. That's what matters." And she was right, though it would take Rose decades to fully understand it. The legal victories and labor reforms were important, but they were also impersonal and abstract. What mattered, what echoed through the years, was the memory of standing beside her sister and 10 other girls, singing a lullaby that transformed fear into courage and isolation into solidarity. What mattered was the choice to risk everything for people who couldn't protect themselves. What mattered was discovering that power doesn't always come from authority or money or control, but sometimes comes from simply refusing to be silent when silence is what the powerful expect and demand. Rose McCarthy never became famous. She never gave speeches or led organizations or saw her name in history books. She sewed and survived and raised Catherine's 3 children after her sister died from pneumonia in 1931, too young at 40 years old, but having lived long enough to see her children grow up in an America that was slowly, incrementally, becoming slightly less cruel to workers and immigrants. Rose lived until 1968, long enough to see labor unions become powerful, long enough to see workplace safety regulations become standard, long enough to see her grandnieces and grandnephews take for granted protections that she'd helped fight for when she was 17 years old and terrified and brave beyond anything she'd thought herself capable of. The photograph stayed with Rose her entire life, kept in the same mahogany music box that her mother had brought from Ireland, the one with the broken mechanism that never played music, but held memories instead. She looked at it sometimes when her arthritis made sewing impossible, and her memories were the only thing she had left that felt truly hers. She'd traced the faces of the girls she'd worked beside, remembering their names and their stories, and wondering what had become of them. Most she'd lost track of over the decades. A few she'd heard about through the immigrant networks that connected Irish communities across America. 2 had died young, one from tuberculosis and one from complications of childbirth. Several had returned to Ireland. A handful had built lives that were comfortable if not prosperous, had raised children who became teachers and nurses and small business owners. But what Rose thought about most when she looked at the photograph wasn't the individual fates of the girls in the picture. It was the moment itself. The 60 seconds when they'd all been singing together, their voices blending into harmony that was defiant and beautiful, and so fragile it could have been shattered by a single wrong move. The moment when they'd all chosen to trust each other, to believe that collective action might be possible, to hope that their sacrifice might mean something beyond just their own survival. In January of 1968, 3 months before Rose died at age 79, her grandniece Sarah came to visit her in the small apartment she'd lived in for 30 years. Sarah was 19 years old, a student at the University of Connecticut studying labor history, and she'd heard family stories about Rose's involvement in the Pemberton factory closure, but had never understood the details. She asked Rose to tell her the whole story, and Rose did, her voice growing stronger as she remembered details she'd thought were lost to time. When Rose finished the story, Sarah asked the question that historians always ask. Do you think it was worth it? You lost your job, you were blacklisted, you struggled for years. Catherine got sick from factory work and died young. Your mother spent her last years in poverty. Did the sacrifice accomplish enough to justify the cost? Rose thought about that question for a long time before answering, her arthritic fingers still holding the photograph that had captured a moment 62 years earlier. I don't know how to measure worth that way, child. I can't add up the number of lives saved by safety regulations and subtract the cost to my family and determine if the equation balances. That's not how life works. What I know is this. I had a choice that night between staying silent or speaking up, between protecting just my sister or trying to protect everyone. And I chose to speak up, and Catherine chose to stand with me, and 10 other girls chose to trust us. We didn't know if it would work. We didn't know what it would cost. We just knew that staying silent felt like dying slowly, and speaking up felt like being alive even if it was dangerous. She paused, looking at her grandniece with eyes that had seen too much, but somehow maintained kindness, despite all the reasons she had to be bitter. The world tells young women like you were, like I was, that you have no power, that you should be grateful for whatever scraps you're given, that complaining or resisting or demanding better will only make things worse. And sometimes that's true. Sometimes resistance does make things worse. But sometimes, if you're very lucky and very brave and you find the right people to stand beside you, resistance changes things in ways you can't predict or measure. And even if it doesn't change the world, it changes you. It teaches you that you're capable of more than you thought. That courage is possible even when you're terrified. That solidarity is real and beautiful and worth fighting for. Niece Sarah took notes throughout the conversation, and those notes would eventually become part of her undergraduate thesis on women's labor organizing in early 20th century Connecticut. The thesis included the photograph of 12 girls sewing under gaslight, along with testimonies from other workers and documentation of the labor reforms that followed the Pemberton closure. It was good academic work, thorough and well-researched, but it couldn't quite capture what Rose had tried to explain. That some truths are too personal and too complex to fit into historical analysis. That the real legacy of that night in March 1906 wasn't just the laws that changed, but the knowledge that change was possible when people chose courage over safety. Rose McCarthy died on April 15, 1968, and according to her wishes, she was buried with very little ceremony in a modest plot in Mount St. Benedict Cemetery in Bloomfield, Connecticut. The funeral was attended by family members and a few elderly women who'd worked alongside her in those early years, their faces showing the particular exhaustion that comes from lives spent working too hard for too little reward. There were no speeches about her bravery or her legacy, no newspaper articles commemorating her contributions to labor reform. Just a quiet Catholic funeral for an immigrant woman who'd survived longer than many people like her managed to survive, and who'd tried her best to leave the world slightly better than she'd found it. But before Rose died, she'd made one specific request about the photograph. She didn't want it donated to a museum or historical society. She didn't want it displayed publicly or used in exhibitions. Instead, she gave it to Sarah with instructions to keep it in the family, to show it to future generations, and to tell them the story not as history, but as memory. As a reminder that their great-great-aunt Rose and their great-great-aunt Catherine had once been young and scared and brave, and that they'd made choices that cost them dearly, but meant something nonetheless. The photograph lives now in a small apartment in Hartford, not far from where the Pemberton factory once stood before it was demolished in 1947 to make way for a parking lot. Sarah, now 73 years old herself, keeps it in the same mahogany music box that Rose kept it in, the one with the broken mechanism that never played music. She shows it to her grandchildren sometimes, when they're old enough to understand but young enough to still believe that individual choices can matter. She tells them about Rose and Catherine and 10 other girls whose names are mostly forgotten now, but who sang lullabies in the darkness because that's how you remember you're human. And sometimes, when the apartment is quiet and Sarah is alone with her memories and her inheritance of photographs and stories, she thinks about what Rose told her in that conversation 3 months before she died. That courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about choosing to act despite fear. That solidarity isn't about perfect unity or shared ideology. It's about standing beside someone when it would be easier and safer to stand alone. That sacrifice doesn't always lead to victory. Sometimes it just leads to more sacrifice. But that doesn't make it meaningless. It makes it human. The lullaby that Rose and Catherine sang that night in March 1906 has mostly been forgotten now. Languages change, cultures evolve, and songs that once carried coded messages of resistance become quaint relics of immigrant nostalgia. But every few years, someone in the McCarthy family learns The Blackbird's Promise and teaches it to their children, keeping alive a melody that once meant so much more than just a way to pass the time while sewing through endless nights. And in that persistence, in that refusal to let the song disappear completely, there's a kind of victory that history books don't measure but that matters nonetheless. The photograph itself, the image of 12 girls frozen in gaslight with their needles held at identical angles and their voices raised in harmony, remains what it always was. Evidence of a moment when ordinary people did something extraordinary. Proof that resistance is possible even when power seems absolute. A reminder that the choices we make when we're young and terrified and brave echo through generations in ways we can't predict or control. And most importantly, a testament to the fact that love and solidarity, and the stubborn refusal to accept injustice, are forces powerful enough to change the world, one small act of courage at a time, even when those acts cost us everything we have and leave us wondering if the price was worth paying. That's the real story behind the photograph. Not the labor reforms or the newspaper articles or the historical significance that academics study and debate, but the human story of sisters who kept promises, of girls who sang in the darkness, of immigrants who discovered that America's cruelest lie wasn't that the streets weren't paved with gold. It was that they'd been told to be grateful for the chains. In the end, this fictionalized story reminds us that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the quiet decision to act even when your voice trembles. It shows that solidarity can begin with something as small as a song, and that love, when shared through sacrifice, can echo across generations long after the music fades. What would you risk to protect someone you love? What secret would you keep or reveal if it meant saving others? And what song from your past still carries the sound of courage? If this story stayed with you, write the word "sing" in the comments so I know you watched until the end. Tell me which city you're watching from and, if you'd like, share a family memory or story from long ago that deserves to be told here on this channel. If the story moved you, please consider subscribing, liking the video, turning on the notification bell, and sharing it to keep these voices from being forgotten. And when you're ready, click the end card to continue with the next story. Because every photograph holds 1,000 untold lives.